Canada is launching a new multilateral defense bank that uses significant financial leverage to mobilize military lending, and it raises real questions worth understanding before the narrative gets set. Good evening, I'm Steve, and this is the Daily Brief Canadian Macro. Today we're covering three major developments affecting Canadian investors. Russell Matthews broke down Canada's new Defence Security and Resilience Bank and how its leverage structure shifts risk in ways taxpayers should understand. Over on the David Lin Report, investor Clem Chambers, who correctly called the timing of recent conflicts, explained why he's moved to cash and what signals he's watching. And on Ron Butler's Angry Mortgage podcast, mortgage broker Rob Campbell shared ground-level data on Canada's housing market that reveals who's actually buying right now and who's stepped away entirely. Let's start with Russell's analysis of the new defense financing structure. Russell Matthews covered Canada's launch of the Defence Security and Resilience Bank, or DSRB, which he describes as using significant financial leverage to turn $40 billion in committed capital into $1 to $1.6 trillion in potential military lending. Matthews argues this structure shifts risk from private banks to taxpayers while giving politicians a way to meet NATO spending targets without a direct hit to the national debt. The bank uses what Matthews calls a 40 times leverage multiplier. Countries contribute 20% in cash, Canada's share being $2 billion, with the remaining 80% as callable capital, meaning an $8 billion potential obligation if the bank were to fail. It's worth noting, though, that this structure closely mirrors how other multilateral development banks operate. The World Bank and the European Investment Bank both use callable capital and government guarantees in a similar fashion, and proponents argue this model is precisely what allows AAA-rated institutions to unlock low-cost lending that individual governments couldn't access alone. What Matthews flags as the key concern is that banks, which historically avoided lending to defense contractors due to ESG commitments and perceived risk, now get government-backed guarantees that make those loans far less risky on their books, while taxpayers hold the downside. The 2008 parallel he draws, where risk was repackaged and obscured through complex structures, is provocative and worth keeping in mind as the governance details of this institution are still being finalized through negotiations that only kicked off in Montreal last week. Over on the David Lin Report, investor Clem Chambers, who claims to have correctly predicted the timing of recent conflicts, revealed he sold all his positions and expects prolonged market volatility. Chambers argues current market spikes are bear market rallies rather than sustainable trends, pointing to the pattern where bull markets drift upward steadily while bear markets produce violent spikes between downward moves. He categorizes a recent 2.5% S&P jump as fitting that bear pattern, and he's using Bitcoin as an early warning signal, noting it surged days before Iran was struck, which he takes as evidence that insiders had advanced knowledge. That Bitcoin as leading indicator thesis is interesting, but should be treated with some skepticism. Crypto is notoriously volatile for a range of unrelated reasons, and the timing correlation could easily be coincidence rather than a reliable signal. On oil, Chambers argues that $100 per barrel isn't historically extreme given the pre-2008 highs above $140, and he puts a 60% probability on boots-on-ground escalation in the Middle East. Whether you share his read or not, his broader point, that markets may not be pricing in worst-case Strait of Hormuz scenarios, is a legitimate question to sit with. On the Angry Mortgage podcast, Ron Butler sat down with mortgage broker Rob Campbell and shared ground-level data from the Canadian housing market that paints a clear picture of where things stand. The majority of calls Campbell is fielding are renewals, with roughly half of those turning into refinances to consolidate debt rather than straight renewals, a sign of financial stress working its way through household balance sheets. Purchase activity is running well below 5, 10, and 20-year averages with what Campbell calls dismal January and February numbers. The buyers who are active are predominantly public sector workers whose stable employment and incremental raises make them one cohort still qualifying with confidence. On the affordability side, Campbell notes that starter homes in Guelph, for example, are now available in the $650 to $750 range, down meaningfully from 2021 peak prices, which he sees as a genuine window for first-time buyers who can qualify. That pullback from peak pricing is actually a real development worth acknowledging. While affordability remains stretched by historical standards, despite Prime Minister Mark Carney's recent remarks, the correction from 2021 highs has been more significant than the broader narrative often does suggest. Most striking, though, is investment property activity. Campbell reports essentially zero investor inquiries, even in university towns where April typically brings a wave of rental demand. The math simply doesn't work. Rental income no longer covers mortgage payments, taxes, and maintenance, let alone generate profit, so investors have stepped away almost entirely. Today's stories share a common thread: risk being reshuffled, mispriced, or avoided depending on where you look. Matthews argues the DSRB moves risk from private banks to taxpayers through government guarantees. Those supporters would counter that this is how multilateral institutions have always worked, and the question is whether Canada's government stake justifies the exposure. Chambers sees equity markets mispricing geopolitical risk, interpreting recent rallies as bear market behavior rather than genuine recovery. And Campbell's housing data shows investors pricing risk almost too conservatively, so cautious about negative cash flow that the investment property market has effectively seized up, even as some affordability metrics have quietly improved. The honest takeaway is that these are perspectives worth hearing critically. The DSRB's final structure isn't settled yet. Chambers has been right before, but calling bear markets is notoriously difficult, and Canada's housing market is genuinely uneven, stressed in some pockets, correcting in others. As always, the full picture is more complicated than any single take. Well, that's your daily brief for today. All credit goes to the creators featured. The original analysis and videos are linked in the description below. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's brief, and don't be afraid to comment if there's another creator you think deserves a highlight here. I'm Steve. As always, nothing here is financial advice. Everyone's situation is different, so please do your own research and talk to a qualified financial advisor before making any investment decisions. Good night.